Hello, and welcome to the last panel for the World Model United Nations Day, where I will discuss how to create and debate draft resolutions, and we'll finish this panel with some personal anecdotes and additional information that may aid to serve you in your future endeavors. My name is Patrick Jurkowitz, and I have been involved with Model UN for over 10 years. I first got into Model United Nations when I was beginning middle school, and I've continued to practice it ever since, be it by competing in conferences, hosting debates, or even teaching students how to execute their own discussions. Resolutions, their drafts, and working papers sprout towards the end of the conference, and their emergence tends to be mentioned in the penultimate session, although it is not uncommon for working papers to start being put together in the antepenultimate session. Of course, depends on the overall conference length. Throughout the conference, your delegation should be taking notes down on talking points you, your peers, and the dais and chairs have been making. These points will serve as a backbone to your working papers and resolutions, as they will most probably form your first clauses. The time and energy you should spend on forming your ideas should be spent in proportion to the time of the caucus the committee is in at a given time. A moderated caucus, or formal debate, is the basic kind of session you will experience throughout the conference, where delegates are able to make comments, proposals, and points of thought to the rest of the present committee. You are able to write clauses during this caucus, although socializing with fellow peers may be disruptive for those around you, and you may be asked to communicate with them outside of the conference room if verbal communication is needed. This can be resolved by passing notes to them, or, if possible, sending a co-delegate outside to talk with other delegations, while the other stays within the room to keep track of the flow of debate. An unmoderated caucus, or informal debate, is where delegates are able to freely move around and talk to others without breaking decorum. And that is where most of your efforts will be applied in writing. This is also the type of debate that will be most common towards the end of the conference, with the former type ruling the beginning. Finally, as a little secret, some delegates will even opt out to work during breaks and in between sessions. There is no specific rule that disallows this. However, it is considered to be poor form if you bring pre-written clauses, that is, ones written before the conference committee began on the first day. Let's quickly review specific parts of the committee's timeline. The first third to half of the conference will be delegations introducing themselves and their thoughts on a given or chosen agenda, the purpose of that committee. Moderated caucuses should yield fruitful debate, and you will be finding delegations that share the same thoughts as yourself. When these groups emerge, they are known as blocks. These very blocks are the ones that tend to present the working papers, which then become draft resolutions. When breaking down a block to its basic components, you will usually find a small group of delegations that seem to be leading the block. These delegations will most probably become sponsors. The title of sponsor is one that would allow said delegations to present and defend the papers and resolutions in question. The amount of sponsors a paper and resolution may have is set by the committee's dais. However, there are also usually more than sponsor slots. These other delegations are usually considered automatic signatories. However, it is important to remember that anyone within the committee that is a delegation and present during roll call can be a signatory. A signatory is any delegation that expresses its will to listen to the paper resolution to be presented, but it does not necessarily mean that they will vote in favor or even against the paper resolution. Generally speaking, automatic signatories are in the same voting block. We shall now begin the process of writing a resolution. The first step is a working paper. These are largely informal and unprocessed ideas delegations had that were put together that tend to already signify the thoughts of that block. I should note that many experienced delegations will already start formatting and creating the working paper in a resolution-like manner to save time for later on. And this is generally what helps the working paper become approved faster by the chair and the dais. Let us now take a look at a real, well-known resolution, the United Nations Charter. Here we have the UN, which essentially created the United Nations that we know and mock debate today. Every resolution starts with a list of preambulatory clauses. You can think of them as a mission statement. They range from expressing the bloc's thought on real-life events, reference past resolutions, both within and outside the UN body, and even summarize key thoughts behind the resolution's operative clauses. There should not be more preambulatory clauses than operative ones. Here is a sample of preambulatory and opening clauses for your resolution. You will note that while there are several different kinds of preambulatory or opening clauses, most of them stem from the same fact that you're introducing something to the committee that you are working with. We see back here at the United Nations Charter preamble that they have, we the peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, to promote social progress and better standards of life. And they continue because, of course, the United Nations Charter is almost a compendium and a testament to what was done long ago and still stands nowadays. When you learn about the UN Charter, you will see here on the left, for example, you have the preamble, and it is broken into different chapters, of which the articles are a similar purpose. And towards the end, which I will talk upon later, you have the amendments that can be done either to the Charter as a whole or specific chapters and or articles. Now, after your preambulatory clauses come your operative clauses. If preambulatory clauses are the appetizer, then the operative clauses are the main course. They represent the proposals and actions the bloc wishes to implement by the conclusion of the conference. Within Model United Nations, you can usually differentiate preambulatory from operative clauses by italicizing and numbering them respectively. Here's a sample of operative clauses. Applied into the United Nations Charter, we now take a look at Chapter 1, Article 1, Purposes and Principles. Article 1. The purposes of the United Nations are: 1. To maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. 2. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. 3. To achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And 4, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of those common ends. Now, while we may see that these operative clauses may almost mimic preambulatory clauses, it is important to note that first of all, the United Nations Charter is a compendium, and within its own right, it can be looked upon and analyzed as though each chapter was its own resolution, and the articles within the preambulatory clauses and then the subclauses are part of said articles. Typically, within a Model United Nations conference, you won't really be writing articles. It'll only be clauses and subclauses to expand upon the ideas that you are writing to express to the rest of the committee by the conference end. So if we were to analyze Article 1 as a resolution by itself, we can sort of understand that the purposes of the United Nations would be the preambulatory clause, albeit expanded, of course, to give it a bit of background for the resolution. And then what are the purposes of the United Nations? The clauses will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can see this, for example, later on, when we see the General Assembly, which is Chapter 4. The composition, the functions and powers, voting, and procedure would all be some things that could be highlighted within a preambulatory clause. So for example, we would go back to this first page of the sample preambulatory on opening clauses. And we can say, for example, declaring that the United Nations is an important institution to international peace and maintaining said international peace. We would like to bear in mind the need for a democratic process of how to resolve issues, debates, and create organs within said United Nations. And then we can go having adopted, well, not in this case, since this was the creation, but keeping in mind, observing real life events, taking note of what might be needed in the future. We can thus go into expanding what the General Assembly's composition, functions and powers, voting and procedure can be or will be. And that's always able to be modified via amendments towards the end of a resolution. And it does not necessarily have to be within the same session of the United Nations. It is, however, during the same session of Model United Nations, since a conference has a definitive end. It is rare, albeit nice, when conferences tend to take over from past years and build upon resolutions they have made as a sort of continuing testament that has been done throughout said Model United Nations career. So your block has now introduced a draft resolution. Now you have the possibility to amend it. Amendments are either friendly or unfriendly. A friendly amendment is one approved by the resolution sponsors and will automatically be inserted into said resolution or working paper. An unfriendly amendment is not approved by all the sponsors of a resolution and therefore must be introduced and voted upon by the whole committee. As the conference end nears, the committee chair may ask for some merging of resolutions, if possible. This is a natural request, as there may be voting blocks that have the same goals. During the merger process, you should not take it personally if some clauses are either removed or combined. After all, the end goal is to have the best iteration of your resolution possible that meets the diocese parameters, typically defined by page length. Once the final version of all the resolutions are made, the committee enters voting procedure. As mentioned, a resolution sponsors are automatic signatories tend to vote in the same procedure. And while some conferences may only have one specific resolution that is able to pass, sometimes it is the first one that passes by a vote during the committee. Another time it can be the one that received the most favorable votes or a percentage. It's always defined differently for the conference, so it's important to look into the rules of procedure. In any case, I hope that all of your resolutions pass in favor, and thus typically ends the last major aspect of the conference's committee. So let's quickly review parts of a committee's timeline. The first third to half will be the delegations introducing themselves, which you already know. The moderated caucuses should feel fruitful debate, and then the blocks emerge. The resolutions are made, they're debated upon, and then they're voted upon. In my personal experience of all of the conferences I've had, I've found that the ones that yield the best resolutions are those that actually draw in upon different aspects of knowledge. You can be debating food security. You could be trying to amend the Security Council. You can be looking at cybersecurity. It's actually quite interesting that I mentioned security 3 times in 3 relatively different components that the UN deals with. Because security, you'll find, is one of the most important aspects debated in almost every single type of agenda conference committee. This is because while you are trying to create something for the United Nations body when you are debating, you also need to make sure that it is able to withstand the different procedures and battles that may go against what you're trying to create. Generally speaking, an economic plan is always good to propose along with in resolutions. And you will find that sometimes when you have different types of knowledge that may not seem directly relevant to what you are creating, you will find that you can draw parallels and allegories and shape it in a way such that your knowledge becomes relevant and constructs upon the resolutions and working papers that you and your fellow delegates are creating. One perfect example of this is viewed with the UN Secretariat, where you have different departments and bodies talking within how to organize and manage the United Nations. I remember once that one of the first international conferences I had, I was the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And it will be a delegation that stays to my heart to this day. And while it was an international conference for high schoolers, the fact that I had to highlight economic plans as was part of my department was what set me aside, despite being a department as everybody else. Thus, it is important to not only research, what your delegation is and is responsible for, but also how to act and react to certain situations within the committee. Taking that example, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs would definitely stand for an economic plan, whereas perhaps a different body might be looking for the backbone of the process in general, not necessarily looking to flush it out. Do not worry. You can always introduce amendments into your resolution, as mentioned before. But there's also a little tip and trick that many experienced delegations will do when it comes to voting procedure. Sometimes there will be points of contention during a resolution, perhaps because there was a result of a merger, or perhaps because one or two clauses do not necessarily resonate with most of the voting bloc, despite being productive to what the resolution may do. Thus, the sponsors might propose to vote upon the resolution as a whole, and then the resolution without said clauses. This may be an effective end to bring about what the committee as a whole might feel is best to move forward with when it comes to voting procedure. Anyways, I hope that this panel has served you well with your Model United Nations ventures. If you would like to look at the websites that I referred to in this presentation, they are UN.org, the United Nations official website, and bestdelegate.com, which I've actually found to be quite useful when I started out with my Model UN career. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy World MUN Day and that your passion for debate and international relations grows. Goodbye to all of you, the best delegates of the future.